The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong, internationally recognized ambassador for world peace, visiting prominent leaders around the globe, discussing the cause of world problems, and proclaiming the good news of the world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Herbert W. Armstrong.
Just what is the Worldwide Church of God, and how did I come into it? You know, in this program, I want to tell you something about my own life and how I came to come into the Worldwide Church of God and the experience that I've had in my life. Up until age 16, I think I lived a life about the same as any other American boy. I had just one thing in mind, and that was a word spelled F-U-N, fun. About all I thought of, I think, up until age 16 was fun. But at age 16, I had the first job of my life away from home, and the man I was working for would put his arm on my shoulder and tell me how well I was working and what my performance, it was very good, and that he could see in me abilities, and that he knew I would go places in the world. And he kept telling me this kind of thing and encouraging me, and somehow he aroused ambition in me. And I came to realize that ambition was just two things. Of course, it's a desire to succeed and to have, but also it is the resolution to work and to produce that desired result. And it doesn't come easy, and I knew that. Immediately, I began to study more than just the high school lessons. I began to frequent the public library, and I was reading books in the line of business administration and also on the shelves where the books on philosophy were located. I began to think more seriously about life. And at age 18, I found a book in the library called Choosing a Vocation. It put me through a self-study course of self-analysis. Then it took me through a survey of various occupations, various kinds of jobs and professions, and it seemed to me that I fit in the advertising profession. Now, at that time, advertising had nothing to do with television commercials. No one had ever heard of television at that time. No one had ever heard of radio. There was no such thing as radio or television. I'm talking now about, let's see, about 1908 or 9. And way back when, before the days of either radio or television. And advertising consisted mostly of newspaper and magazine advertising. Of course, there were billboards, streetcar cards, and direct mail, and a few things like that, but primarily it was newspaper and magazine advertising, and I was interested in writing copy for advertising in magazines or newspapers. And so I took up the advertising profession. Now, at that time, there was no school or no college or university anywhere in the United States that had a course in advertising and merchandising that was worth attending. My uncle, my father's younger brother, was the leading advertising man in the state of Iowa. He was the first president of the state association, and so I naturally went to him for advice. And he told me that if I would procure the books, and if I'd spend my evenings in study, and if I would apply myself, I could get just as good an education, and perhaps better, out of college than I could in. He said, education doesn't necessarily consist of traipsing over the door sill of a college classroom or sitting in an armchair before a college lecturer. However, I realized, too, that education consisted to some extent with contact with others who have an influence over you and who can teach you. And education consists of study, it consists of thinking, it consists of mixing minds with other people, it consists of travel, it consists of observation and thinking and action. And so I decided that I had the ambition and the desire to work, and I would get my education in that way. Well, I was quite successful. Now, he told me to start on a daily newspaper. They didn't need any help. And so I had to convince them that they did need help, that they didn't find ambitious young men very often like I was, and that they were going to miss something if they didn't hire me. And somehow, I guess my young bravado must have convinced them I got the job. And pretty soon the rival newspaper was offering me a 33 1/3% advance in salary if I would come over to them, because I was taking too much business away from them in the advertising department. Well, to make a long story short, I went on. I was in the newspaper for a year, and then I was in the magazine field with the largest trade journal in the United States. For them, I handled the advertising copy for a trade journal agency, as we had established there. And part of the time, I traveled all over the United States for editorial material for the magazine. And finally, by age 28, I was making what in today's dollar value with inflation would amount to about $250,000 a year. And I think not many young men of 28 today have advanced quite to that extent. Then later, and it was in 1926, late in the fall of 1926, I had a strange experience. I had lost all interest in religion at age 18. My whole interest was in business. I dropped out of church attendance. I remember that my wife and I, shortly after we were married, had joined a Methodist church because it was close at hand in the suburb of Chicago where we lived, and we liked the preacher and we liked the people socially, and I think that we joined it just like most people join a church. Never occurred to me, why should there be a church and what's the purpose of a church or anything like that. I just suppose all good people went to church. And I wanted to be good and wanted to be respected, and so we joined the church. Otherwise, I had no special interest in religion. But, as I say, it was at age 34, late in 1926, my wife took up with something that I considered absolute religious fanaticism, and I was absolutely shocked, because I was very much in love with my wife. Our marriage did last 50 years until she died, but our marriage was threatened, because I wondered, well, what would business colleagues think? My wife had taken up with what I regarded as the Jewish Sabbath, Saturday instead of Sunday. Now, can you imagine that? To me, that was outrageous, and that was way out. And I said to her, well, the Bible teaches that you must observe Sunday. Thou shalt observe Sunday. She says, have you seen it in the Bible? I said, no, I don't know much about the Bible. Well, how do you know it's in the Bible? And she asked. Well, I said, because all the churches observe Sunday, and they get their religion out of the Bible, don't they? Well, she asked, well, do they? Do they? Well, certainly anybody knows that. Well, she said, how do you know? You just take it for granted that they do. Why don't you look into the Bible and find out for yourself?